the education panel. The purpose of the meeting today is to put questions to our fabulous guests on special needs and disability in London. And what we do is to ask members of the public who are watching us to follow us on Twitter at London Assembly and to take part in the meeting discussion using hashtag AssemblyEdu and hashtag send. And we'll look at what's been posted at the end of this meeting. Our members, let me just ask members to introduce themselves, starting on my left.
Yes. Tony Arbour represents South West London.
Susan Hall.
I'm David Curtin, I'm London White member.
Okay, lovely. And then just in case people are watching and can't see your name labels, can I ask Heather to just start and briefly introduce herself with her title?
Hello, my name's Heather Talbach. I work for Contact. We used to be called Contact Family, but we've just changed our name. And we're a charity that supports families that have a disability. I'm also a parent, and my daughter has a disability as well.
And Anita.
Hello, I'm Anita Devi, an SEN specialist and consultant working across the country, but within London, running a Senko network and a TA network.
Something about the sound, Jeanette.
Yes, sound. If I wave at our... if we'll have a look and see what we can do with the sound, and if I could just ask the guests to just... there are these directional mics. If you sort of project your voice towards them. Anne, welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm Anne Lyons. I'm a head teacher at St John Fisher Catholic Primary School in the London Borough of Harrow, and I'm currently president of NAHT, in which capacity I'm here this afternoon.
Come.
Thank you.
David Bartram, so I worked as an assistant head and SEN teacher at Lambton School in West London, which is a teaching school, and also Acton High School. I was director of SEN for London Leadership Strategy for about 8 years, and I'm working with Future Academies as director of SEN at the moment across their trust, and also doing some consultancy work in SEN.
And next to it is Simon.
My name is Simon Knight. I'm a former deputy head teacher at a 2 to 19 special school in Oxfordshire. Currently acting as the director of the Whole School Send project, which is hosted by the London Leadership Strategy, with a focus on improving the quality of SEN education in the classroom.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Joyce Brocco Amwafo. I'm a parent carer. I have a daughter of 20 years old with autism, and I'm part of the National Network of Parent and Carers Forum. I'm one of the national reps.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we've got a series of questions to ask you, but if you want to come in to interact on a question that's currently being discussed, then just do indicate. And I've got some startup questions relating to the 2014 Act. But before I raise those questions, I just wanted to ask, and I was thinking it was Anita, but it might be you, Heather, if you can just briefly just give us a sense of, the challenges that a child and young person with special needs have to face in a classroom. Can you do that? Or you can both share.
Try to chip in, everyone else. Are you asking about the challenges that the child faces?
Yes.
Or their family as well?
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Because it's the child and the family together. So
Yes.
from your perception, from your perspective.
I suppose I think when children are younger, in some ways they're not as aware of their difference in the classroom. And because children may not being asked to do sophisticated tasks, in some ways I think it's easier. I think it gets harder as your child gets older, and it gets harder for the family, I suppose, because it's about fitting in and feeling you belong. And from a family's point of view, it's wanting your child to get the best support as they are asked to attain more, in a way. I think some children can be bullied because they're different, and some families can feel very excluded, not your child never being invited to someone else's for tea is something that you carry very heavily as a parent. And I think sometimes you feel that if you're not working collaboratively with the school, it can feel a bit like a battle. And I suppose that's why we're here today, is to try and think about how children and families and an organisation that's supporting schools can really work together. Does anybody else want to say anything? Because obviously there are lots of...
I think frustration. Some of our children and young people, number one thing is frustration as a result of anxiety because the lessons being taught in the class are not tailored to meet their needs, and if they've not have any assessment, it's difficult for them to receive tailored lessons. And also playground, they feel isolated and bullied. So these are some of the challenges our children and young people face.
Anita, anything to just add briefly?
I think they've covered the concept of relationships is very key, and the data will certainly show that bullying is certainly high amongst SEND pupils. I think there's also a sense of loss and frustration, but not just in terms of relationships, in terms of the learning. I think if I give it through an example of a child that I worked with, he was in year 5, very able, but struggled, and we did an assessment, and basically had an eye flicker, and he wasn't seeing the board. We sent him to hospital and he had proper glasses put in over the summer. When he came back in after the summer, he said, the board's not moving now, and I can see. And it was like he just thought that was what happens for everyone. And so it's a sense of not knowing and feeling, a bitter out loss. But that's, children in the mainstream are very, complex needs. Sometimes they don't have the speech and language communication needs to express how they're feeling, to express what they're thinking, and yet they are thinking and cognitively often very able. So it's just, there's a sense of frustration within that as well, that they're not able to always communicate what they need, what they feel, or what they can do, and demonstrate that effectively.
Well, thank you for that scene setting. That's really very useful. So, okay, before I go to my questions, let me just get through a bit of formal business. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the panel to note the list of offices held by members set out on table item 2 as disclosable pecuniary interest? Yeah, can I ask members if they have any additional interest in specific items listed on the agenda? None? Good. And membership. Can I ask the panel to note the membership and the chairing arrangement that was agreed at our GLA Oversight Committee meeting on 2nd June 2017, and that the membership of the panel was agreed, and that's shown in full on your papers. And terms of reference, can I ask the panel to note the terms of reference for the education group, education panel, as laid out on the agenda? And in a sense, I can read out the terms of reference for our guests, and that is to keep under review and investigate as appropriate the development and delivery of the Mayor's policies and strategies in relation to education, and to report back to our Oversight Committee so that if we need then further strategic action, we've got our committee in front of us. I also, I don't know whether you know, but it's good news, is that we do have a deputy mayor whose remit is about London's children and their well-being, so they're our children, and that development is new, so I think that's to be welcomed, and that's Deputy Mayor Joanne McCartney. And we'll be raising some of these issues based on what you're sharing with us today when we meet her in a couple of weeks' time. Yeah, thank you very much. Can you agree the minutes, members, of our meeting held on 6 April? And can you note our list of outstanding actions? Yeah? Okay. Okay. So let me pose the first question, and I'll start with David. But we were just thinking that this question falls into the remit of David, Simon, and Heather. But of course, do come in. The 24 Act was supposed to provide wraparound support for children through new education, health and care plans, and give families more choice and decision-making powers about the type of support they receive. The question for us is, has this happened? And what are the benefits and emerging concerns of the new system? So let's start with this. Has this happened, and what are the benefits and emerging concerns of the new system? David, would you like to start us off?
So the honest answer, and this is just speaking on my experience of going into London schools, is that it is varied, and the local SEND inspections, Ofsted SEND inspections will give you very much that picture, I think. I think absolutely it has been a real challenge for many schools. I think that in terms of increasing complexity of SEN, a lot of schools is providing a challenge. I think there's frozen or reduced budgets that many schools are struggling with at the moment, and particularly in London schools. I think there's a lot of this has been exacerbated in terms of issues around recruitment, actually, and the costs of living in London. And talking with the head teacher of a London school recently, you know, it's that raw, actually, in terms of some of the difficulties and challenges. I also think it's really important to remember the context with which a lot of these reforms have taken place. So, you know, that is you know, a very number of significant challenges to London head teachers, from changes to you know, the educational landscape, academies, free schools, changes to accountability frameworks, curriculum, assessment, and so on and so forth. And amongst all of that, in the middle of that, was the Children and Families Act, and head teachers, you know, expected to implement that legislation, as well as all of the other you know, changes that were taking place. And in many regards, I think that London head teachers actually have done an extraordinary job in navigating this unprecedented level of change in schools at the moment. But I have to say also, on the other side of the coin, that I think that SEN provision as a result in many ways has suffered. So, for example, SEN I don't think is frequently represented in SEN leadership level consistently enough across schools, and I think that's really important. We see it there, but I don't think it's consistent enough. I think if we look at the visibility in some national policy, you know, documentation and initiatives and so on, again, SEN can too much, and disability can be too much of an afterthought. And issues where sometimes, you know, issues around funding and the notional budget, sometimes used, you know, to plug gaps. It's almost seen by some schools as an optional budget to use as much as they think that they should. But that's a real, you know, variation, I think, in terms of the priority that schools are giving. That I realise it's not a ring-fenced budget, but I do think that more priority should be given by schools to ensuring that there's high quality provision. So my sense is that there's something of a polarisation going on in schools at the moment in terms of the quality of SEN support. You've got those schools that have always, I think, you know, or very often delivered great support for children, but there have also been those schools that have the support and the quality of provision hasn't been good enough. And you know, I suppose my concern is that is, you know, widening slightly. I would say, though, that where we start to see schools being empowered to be able to deliver the reforms, and one of the, I suppose, concerns is that a lot of the funding and a lot of the, I suppose, direction hasn't always got to the front line. Where schools are empowered, we do see real success. And I think we need to ask some of the questions around that. Why is it that Lillian Bailey School, for example, you know, in Lambeth is, you know, it has 6% of children at the moment with an EHCP consistently achieving outstanding results? Why is it that St Mary's School in East Barnet is consistently achieving, you know, very, very high results? 100% of the children in that school last year at the end of Key Stage 2, you know, meeting expected levels. The TBAP provision, Kingston and Chelsea, outstanding attendance across those schools where a lot of alternative providers aren't managing to do that. Low exclusions in Aylwood Academy, for example. St Mark's, fantastic work around leadership of SEN and ensuring that the SEN department and that and the teachers in that school work together to develop whole school teaching and learning. So there is some good provision there, but I think we need to start understanding and learning why some schools are able to do that effectively and others not so.
Thank you so much for that. Simon, do you want to add on to what you've heard from David?
I mean, I'd like to echo what David's saying in many ways, because I think he's rightly identified that systemic variance is one of the biggest challenges faced by the SEN sector in London, but also nationally. And one of the main reasons for this is that we're talking about children whose educational requirements are profoundly developmentally determined, and they're existing within an education system where the accountability structure is exceptionally chronologically determined. So schools are judged by how many children achieve certain things by a certain age. And we're talking about children who need to be taught what they need to learn now because they've acquired the requisite knowledge, skills and experiences to underpin that education. There's a tension there at a policy level, and there's a tension there that is not getting any easier and in many ways has got worse over the recent times. In terms of variance, it is significant. Interestingly, and I'm sure purely coincidentally, the Guardian published a couple of very interesting articles today on the SEN system. So I can't take credit for the currency or the clarity of this data, because this comes from Louise Tickle's article today. But between 2015 and 2016, there was a 35% increase in refusals by local authorities to carry out education, health and care plan assessments. Around 40% of cases, the family had to wait longer than the 20-week cut-off to get access to their assessment. Without the assessment, they are less likely to get access to the educational provision that their child requires. And when it was refused, 86% of refusals were overturned. So we're finding that the tribunal system is increasingly finding in favour of the families. Now, the distribution of this across London is particularly interesting, and if you bear with me to give you a few figures here, the inner London average for tribunals is 5.6 per 10,000 pupil population. Obviously, that's the entire pupil population, not just the SEN population, compared to a national average of 4.3. But then if you look at the distribution across inner London, Hammersmith and Fulham, 8.2, Lambeth, 8.6, Lewisham, 11.5, and Westminster, 12.1, against a national average of 4.3. Newham, 3.4, Islington, 3.1, Tower Hamlets, 1.3. So you can see there, just across the inner London boroughs, there's an extraordinary distribution in terms of tribunal access by families, or the need to go to tribunal. And if you look at outer London, you've got at the higher end, Sutton 8.1, Kingston upon Thames 8.4, Richmond 8.6, and Ealing 10.5. And then at the other end, Harrow 2.3, Havering 1.3, Waltham Forest 1.1. And so from my point of view, looking at that, I'd be interested to know how the GLA are aggregating that data and interrogating that data to learn from, these boroughs that are showing hugely, divergent data for their families.
Thank you. It's a key point that you've made there. Let's, Anne. You've heard a lot about your members' experience in this area. Can you just elaborate on what you've heard?
Yes, as Simon and David have said, and interestingly, I work in Harrow, which is one of the lower statistically. And what we hear is where it works well is when schools work together. It doesn't matter who you are, what type of school you are, but where you work well together. And it is getting increasingly difficult. In Harrow, for example, mainstream schools, community schools, have worked very closely with their special schools to ensure that we learn from each other, so that we are providing what the children need, not trying to get children to fit a system, because every child is different and we have to meet their needs as they are. And as Simon has said, that developmental model. And that's the same across the country. So it is really important that we do have structures. I like to be solution focused, but that we have structures that will support that expertise and those things that Simon has said about what's working well and how do we spread that across the country.
Thank Yeah. And then going to you, Heather, from what you've heard from our three guests, does that feel to you that these are teething problems with this new system, or are they just bringing up again the ongoing fundamental issues that you would have identified within the services?
No, I think parents welcome many things in the new Act. You know, some of the aspirational elements of the Act, focusing on outcomes of children, and joint commissioning, looking at health, social care and education working together, because often parents felt they were stuck in the middle between organisations. So overwhelmingly, parents really welcomed the Act and the Code of Practice. I would absolutely agree. I think it's really patchy. I think there's areas of absolutely excellent practice. But also, I think there are some areas where some parents feel that nothing's changed. And I would add to the point that overriding this Act is the education system and how schools are measured. And I think that some parents do feel that some schools just aren't interested in their children because they're not going to attain academically. And if you go to a school, what you really want is you want to be welcomed, and you want them to say, we would like your children, your child. And I think some parents feel that schools don't because their child will not achieve, and that's the beauty contest of the system that we have. And I think it doesn't quite fit with the idea of the SEN practice. One thing I would add is that if parents know that a school accepts children, they will all flock to that school. And then you get a school that is overwhelmed with the number of applications they have. So I think that also has an effect on the whole system in a local area.
Some schools deliver
Yeah. Sorry. The question that have just been put to me is, it would seem to me that it could be beneficial for some schools to put up barriers. How would we be able to identify that?
I suppose I think I would not want schools to do that. I think it would be better if schools were encouraged to work together and to share good practice and to share the number of children rather than putting up barriers. I think that wouldn't work, wouldn't go down very well. I don't know what you think.
If you suspect that some schools are reticent to accept children with SEND in any way, shape or form, there are probably ways that you can use pupil demographic data to triangulate school outcomes against school intake. And then what you can begin to see is whether or not those schools that are performing particularly well on accountability measures are also performing well in terms of serving their local community. I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable drawing conclusions on that assertion without firm data in front of me, but I think it's something certainly that would be worth further scrutiny.
Yes, because I think the question has to be asked in terms of you can get a sense of an imperative there. If you're driven by results, then would you be deliberately making hurdles higher for some children?
It's about sort of demystifying the idea that actually, if you're a school that is inclusive and welcomes a number of children with SEN, that in some way your results are going to be harmed. And actually the proof is that if you look at many of London's highest performing schools, they're actually schools with large numbers of children with SEN. Because actually, and I think we'll come on to this later on hopefully, but good teaching of children with SEN is good teaching for all children.
Yes.
But we need to get that story out there. And one of the things that we see, I think, in the reforms in terms of inconsistency is around, for example, the school SEN information report. So all schools now have to publish an SEN information report on their websites, which depicts what that school does in terms of its provision. And for some schools, they've really celebrated their provision and they're incredibly high quality, and they give a really excellent, transparent view of the provision that takes place in that school. For other schools, it's sort of, hidden, 24 clicks away, and actually it is not parent-friendly and it is not transparent. And so I think you know, the sorts of things that the GLA can, you know, may want to think about doing is looking at how actually it can, you know, celebrate and support best practice so that we remove that stigma that many schools, you know, seem to be suffering with.
Yeah, that's so key. Joyce, did you want to come in?
Yes, I think they all stem from lack of aspiration for our children and young people. And I think that if our professionals look beyond the children and young people disability and provide environment where they will be able to flourish and nurture their abilities and look out for better outcomes for them, then I think we will see all this cultural change, because what parents do experience all the time is lack of aspiration for disabled or children with learning disability. And to add to some of the challenges of the 2014 Act, National Network of Parent and Carers Forum, the parents were really involved during the Green Paper. And some of the reports that we've been receiving is lack of quality for the transfer of statement into the EAC plan. And there's some of the statements, some of the transfer from statements are happening without full needs assessment of our children and young people. And also there's many times that parents are not aware that this transfer is being taken place. And also we receive a report that they do take some of the specifications. So all these things lead to lack of confidence in parents regarding their SEN support. So this is what I can add.
Thank you so much. Can I just go on then to taking a look at another area with you, Anne? How is the new system dealing with these children who do not qualify for an EHCP but still have special educational needs?
Again, I think it's variable in schools. There are schools that say every child has a particular need. And as has already been said, it is about high quality teaching, sufficiently differentiated to meet the needs of all children. Coming back, I think, to something that David said, the big issue for schools, and certainly in London, is recruitment and retention, because schools build up that expertise, staff move on, and at the moment we are finding it incredibly difficult to replace them. So you put time and effort into training staff, skilling them appropriately, and you lose them because they're good. Then now they benefit another school, but we are really struggling. And my authority in July, the end of July, we were short of 30 teachers across our 30 or so schools. That just gives you an idea of the recruitment issue that there is in London. So you have, as school leaders, NHT, we're very aware that we need to train our teachers, provide good CPD, but it is keeping those staff or being able to replace them so that you can continue rather than having to reinvent the wheel every time.
Yes, and we've picked this, of course, with the work that we did earlier on this year about education generally, that there is this huge issue about recruitment and retention.
I think the important thing is about developing that culture within the school and making sure that there is that vision. Every child is special, and we need to find the ways to develop them and their education. And you know, it is about good, high quality teaching for all children.
So what's been the impact of the abolition of the school action and the school action plus support categories then? What's your members fed in to you?
I think it's been beneficial in a number of ways, in that we talk about children who are working at a particular level rather than something that is quite separate. So we're looking at the children and the progress that they're making without there being these special categories. So I think it is beneficial, and schools that have worked with each other to develop their systems have found, you know, that's been positive.
Yeah. Is there not, though, a threat that fewer children with SEND miss being identified or actively supported?
I'd like to think that's not the case, and certainly in schools I work with that isn't, because we are looking at every child, and we're really looking at how they move forward in the curriculum, so that it doesn't matter whether obviously there are particular things for children with SEND, particularly complex SEND, but that we're looking at each and every child in more detail rather than in groups, so that we're working towards every child's plan. Now, it might not be in such detail for many children, but every child's plan as to what they need to do, what their next step is.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to my colleague because he's got some questions for Anita and Heather.
Yes, Anita, I want to know really what are the challenges for SENCOs under the new system. I'm very interested to hear, although it's a statement of the obvious, it depends on the caring in each school and of each individual teacher, how they deal with each individual child. But what are your challenges for providing a tailored local offer for each child?
Can I just also come back to the single SEN category?
Yes.
Because I think that kind of dovetails. I think the single SEN category, we need to understand that it's possible for children to have SEN assessed and diagnosed, but still access the curriculum at quality first. So being diagnosed or assessed with SEN doesn't mean that it's always about additional provision. Okay, because if the school is inclusive and they're doing that for all children, it is possible with children VI, high functioning Asperger's, to access the curriculum without additional provision. And I think we need to be clear on, one is assessment and one is what is the provision that goes with it. And I think we confuse sometimes the two. I do believe, Jeanette, you asked earlier around, do I think, or do we think some of it's due to the changes and the change cycle? I personally think it is. Because the change cycle is still in motion. It's been a 7-year process. Officially it finishes next year on the 1st of April. We've got 2 systems running. From a parental perspective, the accountability system is very much the legal litmus test. From a local authority policy development perspective, the accountability is around what works and what's working well. And I think we have within a system 2 accountability perspectives that don't always tie up. And I think we also need to take into account with all the tribunal figures that where mediation is being used, yes, it's being overturned, but mediation is the step that's come in before tribunal, and there is a higher rate of that, but that's much more successful and friendly, because the backdrop to the Children and Families Act was low parental satisfaction in the system, or low confidence. So they had high satisfaction but low confidence. We haven't shifted that, I admit that. But I do feel, coming back to your question around SENCOs, the code, which is the second statutory document that comes from the Children and Families Act, has given teachers much more responsibility around what they do. So certainly when I was a SENCO prior to the Act, it was always down to me to manage the whole SEN provision. What we have now is teachers coming in right from initial teacher training, understanding that they have a responsibility for each and every child. And I think that is going to help with much more distributed leadership. It's not an overnight fix. It's not going to be that way at all. But in terms of SENCOs, I think, from what I've seen of the data, London has a particularly high level of SENCO turnover. So your SENCOs are not retained very high. Now, that's very expensive for schools because the SENCOs come in. Within the first 3 years, they have to do their national award. And as Anna said, schools invest in that quite heavily. It's at least £3,000, but it can go up to 5,000. And then the Senkos move on, and it's a statutory role. And we haven't, so that's within the first 3 years. There isn't actually much beyond that. So one of the things that we have developed is looking at what does the mature Senko or the more experienced Senko need. So things like the Senko Masterclass, giving them, those who've been in post 5 years or more, what's going to retain them and how do we keep their professional development alive and moving forward. So I think that's one of the challenges. From a Senko's perspective, they're always going to say to you time and money. They get varied time to do their role. Many of them are also teaching in the classroom. And if you're teaching and doing a Senko role, and I've been there, you know, taught year 6 and was a Senko, that's quite a lot of juggling to do in terms of time, depending on how much you get. Some Senkos get 2 hours per week to do their Senko role. Some will be less than that, and some get a whole week because their sole role is to be the Senko. So I think there's variance, and I think as David has also said earlier, some have a leadership role within the school and others do not. And that was deliberately not put into the code or part of the regulations because it related to 2008 regulation. I think because with a small school that's quite difficult to put a Senko on the senior leadership team compared to a large secondary. So I think there are some challenges with what status they hold within the school. That status then affects whether they have access to the budget and how much they know about actively the budget. Now, the SEND regulations that comes from the Code of the Children and Families Act stipulates that the Senko should know about the budget. But if you look at the SEND Code of Practice, which is what most practitioners are using, it isn't quite the same. So there is a slight nuance variance between the Children and Families Act and what's recommended in the code. And we have taken this to the DFE and raised some of these questions. So apart from time and money, the things that Senkos will say is probably around accessing health in that kind of professional conversations. When they are doing transfers from statements to education healthcare plans or setting off an assessment, getting the professionals into a room has been quite a challenge, you know, because actually we're busy diaries. And again, I think it's something where we need much more strategic approach to something like this. If I can give you a very good example of how it worked well in a place. So I'm based in Milton Keynes and I was an SEN advisory teacher. And one of the things we did at the beginning of each year is all the services met with every school in the first 2 weeks. So we went to every school as multi-agency teams and met every school. And what we then did is set up the year's calendar for each school as a multi-agency team. I've not seen that level of practice elsewhere. But when that kind of practice comes together, that's when speech and language therapists will say, well, actually, we need to lead on this one. Or the SEN specialists will say, well, we need to lead on this one. Or the health will say, we need to lead on this one. And we're not getting that kind of joint-up conversations. So I think that's an accessing social care. So I think the joint commissioning is still an issue because the local offer hasn't been utilised well. So if you look at Chapter 3 of the Code of Practice, the local offer talks about, you've got the forward-facing, this is what our services are, but behind the scenes, that data should be being used to forward project what's required and when, using current education healthcare plan data, plus things that we know are coming on the horizon. I don't think local authorities are at that point yet because they're still transitioning education healthcare plans. So I think the CCGs have got a big job ahead of them to make that effective and to use the local offer much more. I think it's one of the most unutilised aspects of the code, if I'm honest with you, all the changes, but has the potential to do far more. So I would say that, you know, and the local offers within London vary considerably.
You talked about the multi-agency team, and you specifically mentioned CCGs. Are there any particular weak links across London? I'm not sure whether you'd be the person to answer that.
So when I've spoken to Senkos, and because I'm not a Senko here, but other Senkos, if you look at the NHS, you have community health, you have GP, and you have the hospital. And it all comes under the umbrella of the NHS. So, you know, we would see it as the NHS, but actually they're very three different systems. And I think when you are referred between those, the challenges between those and understanding those systems is really hard. Oh, and then you've got the fourth, which is privately commissioned NHS. So those four aspects all come under the umbrella of the NHS. And I think often as practitioners and parents, we assume they're NHS, they should all be talking to each other. And the reality is they're not. They're 4 different systems running in 4 different ways. So I think one of the things we need to do, and I've asked a colleague to work with me on this, is to define the differences between those 4 aspects of the NHS so that actually school leaders can be much more informed about how to approach some of them and how they're different, and not to make the assumption that they're all the same, because they're not. I think that's one of the challenges.
But you get the same kind of thing, don't you? One refers to, I don't know, I think people still talk about the LEA, thinking that the LEA is a sort of monolithic thing, but in fact it's made up of lots of different things, perhaps don't speak to each other. In your experience, who leads the multi-agency team? Is it the school or is it the NHS?
Majority
Who
of the school.
should it be?
Well, it depends. It depends on what the, the child's needs are. But actually, it's not just about leading. Do we get input? By and large, I would say across the country, it's led by the school, in the school, and managed by the school. And that's, although it's an education healthcare plan, that was never the vision. That was never the vision. So,
Heather, as a parent, who do you think, in your experience, who do you think leads?
I think the school. I mean, definitely the school.
It's the school.
Yeah. And I think, anecdotally, I think parents have difficulty accessing sometimes social care to come along and come to a review meeting as well as health.
And the other point that you made, Anita, was churn. You said that there's a greater loss in London of Senkos. Is that any different to the churn that there is in young teachers?
I don't know the data, I'm afraid. But
you must have a view on that, Anne.
I don't have exact data, but
Yeah.
I think it is similar.
Yeah.
I think it is that general churn, which is, whether you're in central London or the London suburbs, it's we get a lot of young teachers, and as soon as they're settling, they're obviously looking to move out because it's cheaper, and we've lost them. So my gut feeling is that it's similar.
David wanted to come in.
I've had the privilege of being a Senko in London and leading SEN provision in London for about 15 years now. And there was a time, I've taken the department through the time when it was relatively sort of resource rich, through the Excellence in Cities programme and Every Child Matters and so on, and then also through more difficult times, and also navigating a department through the reformers. I think it can be the most wonderfully rewarding job, and I think it can also be one of the most frustrating and disheartening at times. And my sort of subjective view, really, in terms of my experience of seeing schools both outside of London and in, is that the churn is probably greater. I think that the financial pressures on schools impact on Senkos and London Senkos a lot at the moment, and the position is very difficult because as a Senko you're advocating for your pupils, and it's not just about getting what the correct statutory provision or the right amount. Actually, you want the highest quality provision for your pupils as well. That's really, really important. And when funding is tight, there is the Senko often has different priorities to the leadership team. So I would absolutely agree with Anita when she talks about some of the difficulties that not being present as a Senko on a leadership team can cause. And there's also narratives at the moment I think are unhelpful for Senkos at the moment, like for example undervaluing the importance of the role of teaching assistants. We've got over 53,000 teaching assistants at the moment, I think, in London. I don't think there is a single Senko in London that would question or doesn't know the value of a highly skilled teaching assistant. But we are seeing, I'm personally seeing when I'm going into schools, a lot of those roles not being replaced at the moment. So yes, there's a focus on the Senko having greater leadership responsibilities. I don't know sometimes if the administrative support and some of the authority that the role requires has necessarily caught up with that. Also important, though, to recognise those Senkos that are doing an absolutely, fantastic job in schools across the capital.
Okay, thank you for that. I wonder if we can broaden this out, Joyce. Is there a postcode lottery? In London, are there places which are infinitely better than others, or is there a consistency?
I think as part of the London Parent and Carers Forum, we do receive consistent reports and I can add to the sense support, because we have evidences from parent carers who have received letters from their schools that their children or young people's support can no longer be provided due to lack of funding. And when this happens, parents become frustrated. And also another thing is, some of the TAs who are supposed to support our children lacks professional training. And parents become frustrated and start seeking EAC plan, because they know that with EAC plan, it's legally binded, and also this also put pressure on our local authorities. And our local authorities, they have responsibilities, but they don't have any authorities over the schools. So what my experience living in London is quite consistency, but some of the problems that our parents and carers face as far as SEN support is concerned.
Would you mind if I just add to that? Sorry. Contact. With the Department of Education, we do a survey 4 times a year to all the parent-carer forums in the country. There's 152 in the country, and I just looked at the results for the last year about parents' confidence in SEN support, because I think it echoes what you were saying, Anne. I think there's a gap between parents' confidence about SEN support, because I think against a backdrop of cuts generally, I think parents are worried that less children are being assessed and less children will receive an EHC plan. And so in some ways that undermines some of the good work that can be perfectly adequate for a child to receive SEN support. So in our recent survey, I think only 3% of the forums that were contacted, we had a 70% response rate, so 114 forums responses, and only 3% of those thought SEN support was adequate in their schools to do positive out.
3%?
Only 3%, and I think 45% were moderately confident. So I'm not saying that is actually the case, I'm just saying it tells you about perception and confidence, and I think there is some work that we need to do about that, because against a backdrop of funding cuts, I think parents sometimes are a bit cynical, and they might think that really SEN support is about not offering their child a plan which has legislative backup. So I just wanted that.
Yeah, I mean, that's very helpful, and that's quite a damning statistic, but for perception, there has to be perception against a yardstick. Yeah. And is the yardstick perfection?
I don't know.
Because there's a statutory level of provision, isn't there?
Yeah, indeed.
Is that the yardstick, or is there some sort of wonderful ideal where absolutely everything that a parent might want and a child might need is provided, which in an ideal, I forgot my phrase, in the best of all possible worlds, but we don't live in the best of all possible worlds. And in the light of that survey, I think you said 45%. That was the second figure you quoted. Thought it wasn't enough. What about the people who thought what percentage thought it was? I assume at the bottom of the thing must be it was an absolutely terrible service. What percentage think that there was an absolutely terrible service?
Well, I suppose 40% didn't feel confident at all. So. You know, it is a spectrum, and I do take your point about it's, you know, what's perfection. I honestly believe most parents of disabled children want the same as all parents of disabled children. They don't want a gold standard service. They want something that's good enough, really. As I've said, I would like to put caveats around this. I just think it's interesting in terms of perception and confidence. And if parents aren't confident, they will try to get a plan, because that's the only way they think they will get what their children needs. And that means that you end up, you might end up with parents that actually don't need a plan going through that process, which is a waste of resources and time and energy and emotion for all of us. So I just thought it's...
So if I could just quickly come in, is that there's a risk there that it starts to create an inequitous system, because you will have the potential of families who have the capacity, either financially or just in terms of time and energy, to navigate the system and advocate very strongly on behalf of their child, as they absolutely should do, will maybe get access to things that those families who are not in a position to be able to advocate as successfully on behalf of their child don't get. What we should be aspiring to is an equitable education system in which every child's requirements are met, based on their identified needs. And currently that isn't the case, and I think we've heard from a number of people today that that's the challenge that we're facing. Part of the reason for that is that there's an accountability imbalance within the education system that seems to draw attention towards those children whose needs are characterised around socio-economic disadvantage. And things like the pupil premium, which is very, very, very heavily audited in terms of inspection, but also in terms of both how finance is spent and the impact of that finance, and the way that Ofsted can mandate a pupil premium review in the way that they don't or cannot mandate an SEND review. And so we've got all sorts of counter-inclusionary policies at play here that actually draw attention away from some of the most vulnerable children in our education system. And forces families to have to work extraordinarily hard to get things that should be their entitlement.
But I think it's fair to say that most schools spend more than the notional budget on SEN support. So if we were to implement something like a SEND review, that we are looking at ring-fencing the funding, which I think would be a step backwards, because actually schools would then not have the flexibility necessarily to actually do what they're doing. So I think that needs to be balanced, where pupil premium is very specific to the child. It's what I call binary data. A child is either in receipt of pupil premium or not. With SEN, it's such a graduated thing that actually to have a ring-fenced funding would cause, because of parental confidence and perceptions, more drive towards funding, and that's not always the answer. So I think we've just got to balance some of those issues when making those comparisons, because there are different sets of data, types of data. Pupil premium is you either receiving it or not, whereas SEN is slightly different.
But how do you live with then this huge disproportional range in terms of spend that we heard from David earlier?
Sure, I mean, and I agree, many schools do spend more than the notional, but many don't as well. I mean, I was in a London school recently that was spending about probably less than a third of its notional. And a quote from a pupil actually that I brought along in that school in year 12 in a London school said, actually, we need more support staff. There are a lot of children here that aren't getting help. That's a direct quote from a London pupil, and they're pretty astute. They can pick up when actually schools aren't spending what they should be. And when you looked at the results of that school overall, actually they were very, very poor. I know we're not going to get into the sort of intricacies of funding and so on at the moment today, but I do think that there does need to be some sort of focus on ensuring that schools are spending their funds for SEN in the best possible way to ensure that there is high quality support in that school.
I think that's absolutely key, is that shining a light on what is spent, how it's spent and what impact that spending has will allow us to better understand the success and failure within the system, which currently we don't necessarily know. We're seeing a lot of investment in research-informed practice within the context of mainstream education, and not so much of that investment in time and in terms of energy is being focused on SEN. And so we risk the situation where people are repeatedly investing in interventions that have limited impact on children's outcomes. And the structure we use to achieve that, I think, is up for debate. I think it's probably fair to say that we don't know enough about what is working well, and how to ensure that we transfer that knowledge and expertise, across the entire system. And the evidence for that is in the variability of perceptions of confidence, of pupil outcome data, in terms of populations within schools and expenditure within schools. There's an awful lot of unknowns at the moment that we could really do with investigating further.
I think it's worth just adding as well, if I may, that. So in terms of the School Action Plus, identification was actually decreasing since around about 2010. There was an Ofsted report that the report did look at identification in schools, and it did find out or discover that actually a lot of the time that school action level of provision was actually making up for poor whole class teaching, as what was alluded to earlier actually. And also SEN can sometimes be collated with falling behind. So actually, which may have contributed to increased numbers at SE and SA Plus. So for example, August pupils at the moment, if you're a child born in August, you're 60% more likely to be identified as having an SEN than a September born pupil. Those sorts of statistics are actually important, I think, for us to consider and reflect on. And the other thing, coming back to the point around parental confidence as well, and whether the reforms are working. So a parent, that I know very well, it took her 8 placements for a parent to finally find a school where her son was going to be able to succeed. So that's a child with the HCP. The 8th placement was successful. So the question for us as practitioners and for policymakers actually is what made the Pear Tree Centre in Stanley Road Primary School really work for that family. That's a school in Richmond. What was it that made that that placement really work? It would have been around the leadership of that particular centre. It would have been around the profile of SEN in that school. It would have been about the high quality communication between that school and the family, where parents genuinely get to contribute to the development of provision rather than just simply sort of feeding back through questionnaires. So we need to definitely learn more about, in terms of where those placements are taking place and are successful, what is it we can do to really ensure that we learn from that best practice.
Thank you for that. Well, yet again, Richmond.
I heard it.
The running joke between myself and my colleague is I represent Hackley, Islington and Waltham Forest, and we would love to get the stuff that they have in Richmond. But David, you're going to have parents heading towards the Pear Tree Centre now.
Apologies, Andrew, for that.
But that's a good thing. So let me hand you over to my colleague David, and we're going to sort of be looking in the future now in terms of where we're going to be going.
Thank you very much. So, yes, good afternoon, and I'll start with Anne, if I could. Looking forward, where do you see the pressure points forming for those with high, medium and lower SEN needs?
I think a lot of it has already been mentioned, David, in that the pressure is on the ability to for schools to be able to deliver what those children need. And, there are many children with SEND needs who should be in mainstream schools and will be very successful. And within the mainstream, I think the pressures are recruitment, retention, funding. I was going to say, actually, I found it very disappointing when Joyce gave the example of, parents getting letters saying we can no longer afford. That's about CPD for that school in terms of how you communicate and what you communicate to parents, because that shouldn't ever be a communication. Because actually, as schools, we're responsible for ensuring that provision for each and every child. And we can't just say we can't do it. Yeah. So we have to find ways to do it. Sorry, did you?
Sorry, yeah, I'm just... Sorry, if you want to carry on, I didn't mean to interrupt. Just that there's a growing population, obviously, in London. The school population is projected to get quite a lot larger over the next 10 years, and that will, of course, mean an increase in the numbers of people who have got special educational needs, disabilities, and EHC plans. So is that something that you're looking into and planning for the future in any way?
So, well, obviously, local authorities are looking at how they can meet those needs, and schools have worked with them. In my own local authority, we've had a huge expansion programme in the primary sector and have been looking at how we can do the same within the secondary sector, which is where the pressure is going to be. Obviously then, you've got, we're now in a situation where there's a reduction of primary pupils, which is now giving us other pressures because we're now got capacity within schools, and when we're in a funding difficulty, that's quite difficult to manage as well. So our primary numbers have fallen slightly, but we've got that big increase coming for secondary, and that's right across London.
There's been some kind of baby boom, is that right? That's sort of going now from sort of 6 to 10-year-olds. Is that sort of how you see it, and then that's going to move up into secondary schools in the next year or two?
Those are the figures that we're given, but it's planners, it's a thankless task because you look at the predictions and they're made on a very good basis, but then things happen that change those figures. So it is a very difficult thing across London to predict, but we do know that there will be more secondary places needed. And so I know local authorities are working with schools in their authorities to look at how we can do that, and with every school, you know, whether it's a maintained school, academy, free schools, we all need to work together, you know, to see how we can meet those needs. I don't think there's any information to say that the proportion of children with SEND is going to change. But it is just within that greater population, there will be more children, many of whom will be able to access their needs within mainstream, but we will also need additional special school places for children.
Great, thanks. And Simon,
looking at the data that you presented to us in terms of what your predictions are in terms of population growth around pupil numbers, and surprised to see the much lower proportion of children that you have in the specialist sector in London compared to national figures, which I think is a real positive, you know, for those that need to access a fully inclusive environment, and are fully supportive of that. I do think that, interestingly, that might create some additional pressures within the mainstream sector because you have less capacity to make use of in the specialist sector. So I did a little bit of looking to see what you had in terms of a pipeline for special schools moving forward, and was actually quite surprised to see you've got quite a few within the free schools model. So you've got 15 in the pipeline according to the data that's held by the DFE. You've also got 3 further special schools identified through the LA competition programme, which in theory will provide you with, you know, something close to the necessary capacity that you've identified. What I would suggest is that the methodology that you've used to identify predicted capacity might be slightly liberal, in as much as there has been a 27% increase in special school places nationally since about 2007 compared to approximately 12% in primary and secondary. So the idea that this is going to remain relatively, you know, flat in the short term in terms of the HCPs and then a progressive growth may or may not be the case. But what's really interesting in terms of that model of providing additional capacity is the extent to which it's in the right places for the right reasons, serving the right communities. So one of the things that the GLA might find interesting to do is to map the types of schools that are going to be opening through the free schools programme against capacity across the different boroughs, because what you may find is that you have additional capacity where it's not needed and less capacity where you actually will need it, because there isn't the same level of systemisation around the allocation of school places through the free schools programme. So that aside, where actually I was kind of quite surprised, you're in a good place in terms of capacity. What that means, though, is if you're going to be looking at somewhere in the region of about 1,930 additional special school places, you're looking at somewhere in the region of 965 staff, 220 of which need to be teachers, 700 plus teaching assistants. I can't even begin to work out how many paramedical support services you're going to need in a context that's been explained to Anne of a real recruitment challenge. So you need to be very mindful that you can create the capacity, but that capacity will only be valuable to London if it can be serviced by teachers who have the requisite knowledge, expertise and experience to be able to provide a high quality education for those children. So, you know, it's I suppose, you know, positives and negatives there, but, you know, it seems to me that you have a pipeline of schools in place that will be able to serve need, but do you have the people to work in them, is the question.
Excellent point.
And the answer won't only be, David, about you know, building more special schools. Actually, it will also be about building the knowledge of our teachers in our classrooms very much. And I think, you know, one of the answers to that is around how we start to unlock some of the expertise and skills that exist within our special schools, within our alternative provisions, also within, you know, an untapped resource, I think, particularly is around our additional resource provisions, which are located in local authorities, often funded by LAs and so on as well. There's a huge amount of expertise very often, I think, that sits in those that I think we could tap into. But when we do talk about that collaboration between those sectors, in the past, I still think it's been very often of either sort of poor quality, or it's been used to sort of tick a box before a child, you know, receives a permanent exclusion. We'll consult with the local special school to make sure that we've done everything that we should have, rather than get that early intervention in there. So there's some really good stuff. And there's a paper by Mumby and Fulham called Inside Out, Downside Up, that talks about, you know, what really good collaboration with schools looks like. And that's about a real focus on outcomes, that lies at the heart of the partnership. It's about long-term relationships between schools, not sort of one-off visits and thinking that everything's going to be solved from that. It's about forming relationships, not just between schools, but also, you know, across that community between pupils, teachers and families. And again, you know, I'll come back to where some schools that are doing this really well. So there's some great piece of work being done in Brent at the moment with Woodfield Special School and the team that are working over there. There's some fantastic work by Swiss Cottage at the moment in this particular area in Camden. The Bridge School in Islington, led by Penny Barrett as well, is doing some excellent work around outreach and supporting mainstream schools, and some centres as well. Yeah, I'm very happy to sort of like forward you details on. So, and all of those schools that are doing great work in collaboration are examples of schools that are outward facing, that are building partnerships beyond their own school. And actually, when you look at the results of those schools, if that is the thing that head teachers are worried about, they're some of the very best, highest performing schools across the capital.
I think that's absolutely, just one additional thing to that, I think that's absolutely key, is that in some ways I think that London as a geographical entity is slightly constrained by the localism that exists within the boroughs, and whether or not, in addition to the local offers that sit at borough level, there should be a London offer, you know, that sits as an umbrella above all the boroughs, so that you can actually aggregate this data and look to absolutely shine a light on the variability, on the recruitment challenges, and on the excellence, so that we can draw attention to that elsewhere. One thing that would set the GLA apart from central government significantly would be do a significant SEN recruitment drive in education. SEN has been absent from getting to teaching for all sorts of different reasons, but it doesn't need to be absent from getting into teaching in London. I think that would have a profound impact in terms of raising the status of the sector, but also raising, you know, attention towards people who may be considering becoming a SENCO, or may be considering working in the specialist sector, to actually explore that within the context of doing it in the city.
Yes, so can I just come back, Simon, for a minute? Because, of course, we've in the past, we've received evidence from London councils, and the lead there, the current lead is also a leader of a borough. So when you talked about this sort of pan-London sort of umbrella, isn't that something that London councils should be doing as a body?
Potentially as a collaborative response to a shared challenge. Yeah, that absolutely could be the case. The question is whether it's operating at that level, whether it will get the attention that is necessary to make fundamental systemic change for these children, and whether this is something that, within the context of a relatively new mayor, you know, is whether we could absolutely put SEND at the heart of education policy, full stop. Again, what this would do is it would shine light in a different way. At central government level, SEN sits with the Children's and Families Department, not necessarily within the Education Department, so we have a separate ministerial responsibility. If we place it at the heart of everything that the GLA does around education, it places these children in a position of importance and status in a way that they often lack that within the context of other policy formation. So I agree, yeah, it absolutely could be done at that level, but equally it could potentially have a greater impact if we had something that was at a slightly higher level as well.
Yes, because there's a sort of strategic piece that brings all the bits together. Yeah. Okay, David, are you? Yeah. Yes. And, so let's hand you over to my colleague Susan, and it's about the co-commissioning piece. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Really, this is probably more Anne and David. What kind of services are you co-commissioning with local authorities and the National Health Service? Oh.
So I was waiting for Anne to complete
Well, certainly within the authority I work in, which you know well, Susan.
Yes.
You know, we're co-commissioning at the moment some services for mental health. You know, working together with the CCG. Also, speech and language services, you know, very much working together. But it's not consistent. And as we've said earlier, it's quite often very much the services that we need in schools are obviously, we're pushing them with schools. What a number of schools that I work with have done is they've started to buy in their own services, so it's not co-commissioning, but they're buying in services that themselves to supplement what they would like from particularly health services.
I mean, we've heard that this is where there is a real problem arising. Do you think it's because it falls a bit between stools, between departments? Because certainly in local authorities, everything's very siloed, or always has been. Or do you think it's because it's not easy to get to the manager involved, or what? What would you, if you said you could fix this, where would you go to fix it to make it easier?
I think at the moment, for a lot of services in London, again, it comes down to recruitment and retention of staff in those services, and the fact that they seem to move around the authorities because there is a shortage of professionals in those areas. So what you find is some of the services that we have used, you know, staff leave, go to another authority that's paying more, and it just goes round like that. So again, it is trying to build up that capacity you know, of staff, of well-qualified professional staff that are there to be used, whether it's between health schools, social care and schools, so that we have got continuity for these children and families that are the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. When with other teachers, head teachers, if they're going outside and commissioning separately, are you getting feedback that that's working better?
Well, schools get a continuity, but I think, personally, I think there's a real risk about that. You know, it's really important that those professionals are appropriately trained, are supervised, and I think if schools sometimes are buying in their own, there is a risk that that will not be the case. So it's really important that we have all the safeguarding procedures in place, and that we are buying in staff who are appropriately qualified. I think it would be much better to be co-commissioning rather than schools going it alone.
I think some of the one of the reasons maybe for that sort of polarisation that I talked about with regards to the quality of provision in schools is that, you know, many of the schools I think that were providing some of the best provision previously had you know, taken a step back, reflected on their broad offer from the start, really looked at where the gaps were and started to build provision that was appropriate and relevant on site for a lot of the time. And so actually the degree with which they're having to go externally is slightly reduced to, compared to some of those schools that aren't putting that sort of early intervention in place, or aren't putting in the right provision as soon enough for many of the children. That's my sort of concern really for that sort of broadening gap in terms of the quality provision, is that actually for a lot of those schools that are struggling, we're going to need to really look at how we ensure particularly that they're getting the right sort of support and external intervention rapidly and that's appropriate. And there are huge gaps still. We talked about postcode lotteries. Yeah. I don't think there's a postcode lottery in provision as such, because I think actually you've got a lottery in schools, and a lot of that will come down to the culture of the school and the head teacher, but there is more of a postcode lottery when it comes down to whether there is appropriate speech and language support, or EPs available, or occupational therapists available, and so on. And when it isn't of high quality, then that's when schools do go, externally or to other providers and so on and so forth.
And would you consider this one of your real worries in this respect?
I was going to say, I think commissioning is one of the key problems that we face within the SEN sector across the board. Whether it's co-commissioning or schools are doing it individually. There's a whole thing around the value for money, and actually whether schools are actually making informed choices about what they're commissioning if they're doing it themselves. The schools forum often decides the budget for that co-commissioning, and whilst they buy into that, they don't actually always get what they need or how much they need, and so they are in a place where they have to go out. But then there is a problem of quality assurance and knowing whether there's impact. I also find it very strange that in terms of, we have a Social Value Act, which is cut across all the other local authority services, but we don't use it in education, and Ofsted didn't put it into their value for money evaluation of schools. So I think that's quite interesting in itself. But I think commissioning and procurement is one of the key problems at the heart of making sure the SEND reforms actually does work. I think it is one of the big issues that we do need to address.
Okay. Has anybody else got any thoughts on that?
I suppose the only one to add really is that you can only commission a service if that service exists, and one of the real challenges faced by schools is that the National Health Services aren't always actually able to provide the service to schools that schools would like, because they can't recruit either. And there can often be very protracted processes in terms of replacing staff as they move on, as it needs to go to funding panels and have agreement to sustain that post. So certainly in my experience, which I appreciate is slightly north of London, is we could sometimes be without a speech and language therapist for 6 months because somebody had resigned, and then the local authority's health team weren't able to actually secure somebody to replace them. So there can be these huge gaps, which from a child's point of view, that's the best part of 2/3 of a year potentially, in terms of lost input, lost access. So it's a very fragmented, I think it's fair to say, situation for schools.
I mean, I think for children that may have a personal budget to spend, also there has been a problem with there not being a market to purchase, because local authorities used to use block contracts, but moving towards a more individualistic way of purchasing. Some of those providers, those other charities or providers they're not sustainable. So some families will have a personal budget to buy something and there's no provider.
So a real worry.
Yeah.
And of course recruitment keeps coming up in everything that we're talking about here. Do you think the problem with recruitment is plateauing, or do you think it's getting much, much worse rather quickly?
I'm just going to say, I went to the London councils recently, and it was talk about SEN, and recruitment was an issue. And one of the people gave the presentation said, if you look at the population of most areas, it's sort of like a glass shape. So the percentage of different age groups is roughly the same. But London's like a pear, so it's a very young city, brings lots of young people in. But just as you were saying, as people get to settle down, they leave. And I think that's just a problem about housing, all those things that we all know about. And I don't know whether it's going to change. I can't see that at the moment. I think it's going to be an ongoing issue, recruitment.
I mean, at NAHT we've looked at, the possibilities of key worker housing, but of course that also benefits the young. Still, when they want to buy, people will move. But I think there are ways, and we do need to work together to look at how we do retain our staff and to be creative about what we do to actually take on those young people, train them up, and hopefully they've got to a level where they can stay in London. Or, as has happened with a number of my staff, they've moved out for a while and furthered their career and moved back. But that is a huge challenge, not just for teachers.
It seems to be for everybody. Thank you. Shall I move on to my next question?
Yes, so please.
Okay. How much does SEND feature in teacher training, and what ongoing support is there for teachers and leaders providing SEND support? Who wants to answer that first?
Well, we hear that there is an improved focus on SEND within initial teacher training. But when you look at the many ways in which teachers train, Schools Direct, Teach First, PGCE, 4 years of an education degree, it's varied. And very much, my school is very heavily involved in Schools Direct, the GTP as was, but it's dependent then on making sure that those students get that training whilst they're working in school. So it is varied. To me, it's really important because if teachers are well trained, it doesn't just benefit children with SEND, it benefits all children because it's about high quality teaching. But schools have to invest time and effort into making sure their trainees start as NQTs with a good qualification.
I mean, from a professional journey, there's quite a lot to take on board from when you're training as a teacher and how much you give them and then how you build on that subsequent years. The Carter Review in 2015 certainly highlighted the need for more of input within initial teacher training. And there's been a lot of discussion of we need that. One of the initiatives that came out this year from the National Association of School-Based Teacher Training Providers was a toolkit on the how. So providing providers, whether they are university-based or school-based, a mechanism of support to first audit what they already do, what they need to do as a basic level, and then how they can build on that on different areas. And that's an open access resource that was launched in March 2017 this year. Still new and still being developed, but I think that's the first time we've moved from everyone saying, yes, we need to have a much more structured and systematic approach to initial teacher training, to addressing the how and actually making it quite concrete and real for providers to go away. And with those providers come the partnerships, so the schools that the trainees go on to, but also their NQT year. So the toolkit has been based and built around this is what you need at a basic level, and then how you build on that year 2, year 3. Because otherwise we could bombard them with the wrong information too soon, and that could be also a negative. So it's about finding that balance for their career progression. So there are resources that are actually now out there that have been developed and are continuing to be developed.
I certainly agree with the sentiments expressed there in both ways. I think in some ways addressing the ITT issue is something of a red herring. I think it's the post-qualification training that we need to be focusing our attention on. If you're doing a one-year teacher training programme, there are lots of competing priorities, and those that have an interest in the education of children with English as an additional language would be advocating very strongly for more EAL within teacher education. The difficulty that we have is once people are qualified is that professional development is often at the discretion of the schools, and SEN is not always a priority. And when they do get access to SEN CPD, it's not always of the necessary quality. The DFE's publication of the Standard for Teacher Professional Development last July sets out what the expectations are in terms of high quality teacher professional development, and yet I still see numerous opportunities being sold essentially within the marketplace to schools that are unlikely to have the required impact on teacher quality in the classroom. I think we need to be much clearer about expressing what high quality teacher post-qualification training looks like, and have a much clearer way of expressing the requirements placed upon schools to enable teachers to access it. I have grave concerns that the reduction in funding that schools have available to them is leading to a significant reduction in accessibility to post-qualification training.
I'd just add to Simon's point that I do think that there is a job for us to do, in schools with the SEN community, really to demystify what good teaching for children with SEN looks like. But it's not some sort of, I think Simon's referred to as an alchemy in the past, or some sort of strange magic that only a few of us, are able to deliver. I believe really some of the leading experts in SEN, that's actually your classroom teacher, period 5, on a Friday when it's been raining or lunchtime, can come in and deliver, a great lesson where all children learn and are engaged, and motivated. That's where, for me, a lot of those SEN experts sit. And they are in their hundreds in London schools. But do we know where they are? And actually that's where the role comes, I think, for some of our teaching schools and the London Teaching School Council as well, which I know are doing some good work on this, but I think the role of teaching schools could be key. I think our skits as well, in terms of the training and how we ensure that a lot of these teachers, that are delivering great lessons for all children, including those with SEN, we shine a light on those.
Okay. Can I just pick up on Simon's point around the CPD? In the SEN information report, which schools are required to publish, there is one question that asks what CPD has been given to whole staff during this year. I certainly advocate to schools that they should keep 3 years of SEN information reports on their websites, not just the current year, but 3 years. And my rationale for that is that then you can compare what's happening year on year and see if there's a real difference. So I would like to see, Ofsted who go in to be saying, well, actually, let's look on year. But that's a good way of actually seeing, is the school investing, not just in those post-qualifications, but for whole staff. And we look at the SEN information report from that perspective to see what has been invested.
Thank you. Just the last couple of questions. And I want to start with you, Joyce. We've heard about the London leadership strategy.
Yes.
What does that mean for you and your network?
As a parent carer, I was invited to be part of the London leadership strategy, and what inspired me is the determination to see every SEN child having the best quality outcome, and also seeing the professionals inspire the aspiration for our children. And this aspiration comes also and also provision of quality teachers that we are talking about now, because if we have quality teachers, they help to provide a better environment where our children and young people can flourish. So London leadership strategy is, to me, one of the best things that can happen as far as whole school science reform is concerned, because it encourages teachers, professional school leadership to provide equal opportunity, inspire our children, know that irrespective of their disability, they have qualities that needs to be nurtured, and if they provide better teaching tailored to meet those needs, our children can have better outcomes, grow up and be part of our society. And also having TAs who have knowledge in SEN. As a parent, some of our parents struggle with disability. Some of them, although they know that their children have disability, but they struggle to accept the term disability. And if you have a quality teacher who will walk you through, support you, and let you know that having a disabled child, there's nothing wrong with it. It's a fresh air, and it helps, especially some of our parent carers from ethnic minority. Perception of disability is a great concern. Many parents don't even want to share, their friends and families don't know about it. But teachers help them to come out, feel accepted, and point them to right places. So I think London Leadership Strategy, they are doing excellent job, and I'm glad to be part of it. And I know that's someone, and so I think that's what I can say.
Well, Simon, I don't think I need to ask you what you think, because you've just received the best endorsement ever. And if you use it, we want copyright. We want copyright to that endorsement. But no, seriously, I mean, thank you, Joyce, for that. Because in our work, we hear so much about the negative, about partnerships and the problems, and that was just such a refreshing experience, and you weren't prompted, you didn't know. I can say you weren't prompted, you didn't know. But Simon, as great as the strategy and the people involved, there are huge challenges, aren't there? What would be your top 3 challenges currently?
I think the most significant one from my point of view is how we bridge the gap between the potential that we're able to build within children in the education system and how that translates into a better quality of life for them once they're outside of the education system. The statistics associated with children with SEND are horrific. Now, if we look at those that have got the more complex needs, 94% of special schools in this country are good or outstanding. Only 6% of people with learning disability are in paid employment, you know, so we've got a real challenge there. So what happens, you know, we build this opportunity in people, and then society seems to bring it back down again. So we've got a social cultural challenge, and that social cultural challenge exists across the entire country, and it's exemplified in data that shows that children with SEND make up the vast majority of those who are excluded from school. It shows that children with SEND are more likely to have a diagnosable mental health condition than those who do not. It shows that those with SEND are more likely to be in the judicial system. And these are all examples of challenges that cannot be solved by the education system alone. So when we're going back to the point we're making about co-commissioning, we also need to be focusing quite clearly on the construction of policy across multiple departments, so that we don't work in silos where we can raise the expectations and aspirations in one part only to see them diminished and dampened in another. So for me, that's probably the primary challenge, is how do we actually take what's happening in an education system that, despite some of the things we've addressed today, you know, is broadly a very successful education system for a significant number of people, and enable society to see that potential in young people with disabilities, and ensure that they're able to fulfil, you know, a meaningful, purposeful role in the communities in which they live.
Thank you for that. And then the last question to all, in the time we've got left, is the question is, does the Mayor have a role to play to help provide adequate SEND provision in the capital? And of course we asked that, and we then ask you, if you think yes, to then, if you like, give us what would be, if you were in the lift with him, what would be your big ask of the Mayor? But I started off by mentioning that Deputy Mayor, well, she's statutory Deputy Mayor, has the responsibility for young people and was appointed by Mayor Khan. What I didn't say, of course, is that there is another mayor, a deputy mayor, and that's Matthew Ryder QC, who's the mayor's deputy for social integration, social mobility and community engagement. And it sort of fits in with the point you've just made, Simon, about this whole challenge, about the social cultural challenge. And I think that's a good starting point. We've got 2 deputies influential around the table. How their work will intersect is something that we're interested to see. But again, it's not just the Mayor, there are these 2 individuals. So, Sir David, ask them all a big ask, or pick one of them. What would make a difference to the work that you're doing regarding SEND?
I suppose the one thing that I'd like to see, which is a complete paradigm shift, is a move away from using equality impact evaluations as a way of determining whether you're going to have a detrimental impact on a vulnerable group with the policies that you're introducing, towards a position where you don't introduce any policy unless it's guaranteed or at least likely to have a positive impact on those communities.
Just shift it round.
Just turn it round on its head.
Oh.
So stop remediating the presumed deficit that it's likely to create and start saying, well, why doesn't every policy that we institute have a positive impact on the most vulnerable in our society? If you use that as a benchmark for the decisions that are being made across all of these departments, then I think you'd see a profound impact on the quality of life that you have in London for people with SEN, but also other vulnerable groups within the society.
Well, certainly music to my ears, and that's a fabulous response that we can certainly share with the two deputies and the mayor. And there are threads of it around the building. You just get excited for a moment, but you just don't know where it's going. David, I'm sorry, let's go back to Joyce then. Joyce, there's these three influential people who are there for Londoners, include, the mayor and two deputies. If you got them alone in a lift and it was stuck, what would you get from them?
Yeah, but I've got two things, and thank you for the opportunity. Number one is the effect of caring of disabled children and young people on parent carers. Having a disabled child comes with other effects like emotional effects, social effects, and physical effects. And I will be most grateful if parents will be appreciated, the work that they are doing be appreciated, and raise awareness on how professionals can support parents in their caring role. And secondly, from ethnic minority background, in London we are blessed with diverse cultures. And I would like the mayor to raise awareness about the effect of or the perception of disability among our ethnic minority. Many of our parent carers from ethnic minority background struggle to even accept the disability of their children due to being isolated from their families. And many times, if you have professionals, the schools, I think the schools, the doctors need to know about this and maybe have a way of working with parents. I have evidences of marriages being broken down because either the wife have accepted and the husband is struggling with it. So raising awareness among ethnic minorities to let them know that disability, we need to look beyond that and look at what is in there, dispel the myth that once you have a disabled child, there's nothing wrong with it. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share this.
Thank you so much. I mean, you remind me of that sort of breakthrough moment that mental health had when Frank Bruno, the boxer,
Yes.
was he heavyweight? He was, wasn't he? Said, and he was the heavyweight boxer of the world, such a sturdy black man, and he said, I suffer from, and that I know from work has had such a ripple through the black and minority ethnic community, and you just need that breakthrough moment, isn't it, when as you've said, we attack the stigma and we attack those issues about being frightened about the reality of our lives. Thank you for that. Thank you. David.
I think I'd probably draw their attention to a couple of sections of the Ofsted report in 2010, actually, which was around the success of London Challenge and what contributed to the success, and still contributes actually to the success of London in terms of its exam results nationally. And one of those aspects was about getting schools and London teachers to think beyond, or be motivated to think beyond their sort of intrinsic sense of duty to their own school. And actually it is about reaching out and working, beyond your school gates and working with other schools in that community. And I think that the challenges that London faces at the moment are not going to be solved by schools working as islands or working, working in silos, and that's, for a whole range of organisations to embrace in terms of, multi-academy trusts and teaching schools and others to really look at how they work, effectively and collaboratively in that way. I think the second point I might raise with them, if I was stuck in the lift, would be that when that Ofsted report took place, a lot of the teachers described themselves not just as head teachers, but as head teachers of a London school or London head teachers. And I do think that sense of identity a little bit, whatever your sort of political persuasion or viewpoints, has been lost a little bit. So I do wonder whether there is a role for the Mayor and the GLA to play in terms of trying to rediscover that identity a little bit, particularly in the area of SEND, so actually to really recognise where that good practice exists, to create opportunities where possible, to establish communities of practice in SEND, I think, to challenge poor practice and also to promote good practice, but also to celebrate, what does it mean to be a leader of SEND in a London school? What does that really mean? What does that look like? And celebrate that, because, generally, I believe we do have some fantastic practice in London. We have some of the best practice in the world, but we need to ensure that continues and that develops far, far much further than it is at the moment.
Excellent, thank you for that. Thank you.
Anne? Bearing in mind that I'd be talking to the Mayor after Joyce, Simon and David, and I have to say I absolutely agree with what they've said, but if I suppose going on from Simon's point, just pulling it back a little bit to, we've talked a lot this afternoon about young children, families, and I just want to come back to that section 19 to 25, which we haven't talked so much about, but I think follows on from Simon's about. I think that's an area that we've got a lot to do in terms of SEND, is about focusing on the 19 to 25 in terms of young people being ready to go out into the world of work, of life, of leisure, well prepared and well supported. And I think it is an area that we haven't given enough thought to or funding to as well. I think it's a really complex area. So I'd endorse what my colleagues have said, but I'd like to add that little bit.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Anita?
They've been in a lift a long time, haven't they? As a systemic leader, I think I would want them, as three of them, to raise the profile and quality and use of the local offer, which will help with commissioning, better commissioning. Because I think that if we really get to grips with how we use the local offer, I think that will also, help with the ethnic minority aspect. Because I totally agree with Joyce. I think there are some real, and it's not just myths. Some of these are very deep-rooted cultural issues that are not just a question of someone standing up. Some of them are quite deep-rooted around some of their own beliefs from back home. And I think, so if they can see people of their own ethnic minority coming alongside them, because that will be through the local offer. There'll be services there of their ethnic persuasion to support them. So for me, the local offer has to be the driver, and anything we can do around that, not just raising the profile, but the quality, because the difference between different boroughs within is very different. So that would be my wish list.
Thank you very much. And Heather?
Well, obviously, I agree with everything my colleagues have said. And you've stolen my thunder, because my disabled daughter is 18. And so I'm looking to the future. And I want her to be an integrated person who is a paid-up member of society and contributes. And I want her to work, and I want her to be able to live independently. And I suppose particularly around work, I don't know what the GLA can do about looking at children, education in its broadest sense, about preparing them for work and supported internships. And I think if I could, I would want to talk to the Mayor about what are the possibilities of the GLA, either supporting or having an award system or whatever, but just working across London to give young people the chance to be integrated members of society.
Lovely. I mean, we can give you some immediate feedback. The Mayor will inherit the adult skills budget from 2020. I mean, your daughter will be 20 then, but still within the 19 to 25 age group. And so it's an ideal time now for us to be sending thoughts, action points to the Mayor and whichever deputy is going to be leading on that. In fact, I know for a fact that it's another deputy. It's how many deputies has he got? but they're all wanting to work together, as my understanding. So another deputy is in charge of the adult skills budget, and we have had meetings with that deputy. So I can assure you it's something that is certainly on our agenda, and that's our job, is to hear from you and help to raise these issues and if you like, get a response from the Mayor in terms of how he's tasking his deputies to look at these issues. You know, I think we have to let them out of the lift, don't we? They all function on the 8th floor, so we'll let them out. And can I just bring this meeting to a close, but just a couple of points. This meeting is the first part. First, no, let me backtrack a bit. This is not our first meeting on the services that, if you like, go into this big suitcase about SEND. We did a previous piece of work on it. And we are going to, we've also sent out a call for written evidence. So, you know, please send in your formal written evidence to us. And we're going to hold a second meeting in November. And that's to explore the role of local and regional government, school forums, the GLA itself, and today what you've highlighted to us is CCGs. So please know that isn't, we're not dabbling in this, it's part of our core activity. And do let us have any more information that you have. And so that just leaves me to thank you all. I mean, I've never taken so many notes at a meeting in a long time, because we can usually summarise what we've heard. We can't today. You've just given us so much. I personally can't wait for the transcript of what you've all said, so that we can pull it together, so that when we meet with these deputies, we can actually put the points that you've raised. And of course, you know, our discussions are then in public, so you can see what we're saying to people and the reports of those meetings. So please know that we're here working on your behalf. And with that, thank you very much. And it's been a really informative session. I don't know what my colleagues say.
Definitely. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. So let's then let me say to the panel members, can they note the report and the discussion that we've had today, which will then go to the further work that we're doing. And thank you, staff, for the, especially you, Charlotte, for the excellent report that you produced for us. Let's go on to item 8, and that is, Richard, can you just remind us of the work programme for 17-18?
Yeah, just as you said, Chair, the next meeting in November is going to be with the policymakers and local government and regional government.
And we're always up for visits.
We'll be going to Swiss Cottage.
Swiss Cottage. So is that you, Anita, we're coming to see? No.
Cottage Special School?
Yeah.
No, that's Jata's school. No.
Okay. So But we had so many examples of good practice. But if you...
Fajita Patel. Fajita Patel is a principal there doing inspirational work.
Oh, well,
Yeah, she's brilliant.
I'll tell her that you said that about her.
It really is fantastic.
I mean, that will just so give me the biscuit, won't it? Whereas these lot won't have biscuits. Okay, so thank you for that. And our date of next meeting is going to be Thursday, 29th November. Thank you. Any other business? There are no urgent business, and so with pleasure I...
GLA Chamber Sound.